Hey guys, tonight we begin with the scent of dust, smoke, and something gently roasting over coals. A flicker of firelight dances on a soldier's face, not from war, but from a makeshift kitchen beneath the stars. The tents are quiet now. The day's marching has softened into silence, and somewhere near the edge of the camp, a pot bubbles with something thick and unfamiliar. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only. If it feels right, let me know where you're watching from. What time is it for you? This isn't the tale of a battlefield. Not tonight. This is the story of what happens when the swords are sheathed and the stomach begins to speak. It's about what a king eats when he's too tired to rule, and what his army chews when there's nothing left to bite but memory. The world remembers Alexander the Great as a conqueror of empires, but beneath the plumed helmet and golden armor was a man who knew the taste of goat's milk on dry bread. A man who sometimes chose dinner over dominance. He moved not just with cavalry, but with jars of honey, sacks of barley, and baskets of strange seeds meant for lands not yet seen. His empire was carved not only with steel, but with saffron, salt, and stews whispered into life over flickering embers. Because food was never just food. It was the first olive before a treaty, the last fig before a death. It was ritual and remembrance, celebration and solitude. It filled the silence between victories and gave shape to homesickness on the road. And so tonight, we'll walk beside his campfires, slowly, through shadowed kitchens, desert banquets, and quiet meals. That history forgot. We'll eat with our ears. We'll taste without swallowing. We'll learn how the hunger of one man stretched across continents, and how his craving was never only for land. Tonight, we begin not with a war cry, but with a crust of bread. Warm in the hand, rough on the tongue. A simple loaf that came before. Empire. And that takes us gently into chapter 1. The bread before empire. Before he was great, he was hungry. Not with the hunger of ambition. Not yet, but the kind that rumbles in a boy's belly at dawn. The kind soothed only by what the hands of a mother or cook might prepare before the sun has cleared the mountains. A slice of barley bread, baked hours earlier in the stone oven behind the house. Dense, slightly sour, still holding the warmth. A fire in its crust. In the hills of Macedon, the morning air was always cool. The ground beneath bare feet still wet with dew. Chickens stirred. Smoke curled lazily from rooftops. And somewhere within that quiet, the rustle of a cloak, the hum of an old song, the scrape of a wooden bowl being placed on a rough-hewn table. That was breakfast. Before swords, before sandals hit desert rock, before maps were drawn with arrows. And red ink, a boy sits. His legs swing, just barely touching the ground. His hands reach out not for scrolls or shields, but for food. Barley bread, a chunk of goat cheese. A smear of sour fig jam, maybe, if there had been enough yesterday to spare, and behind him voices. Low ones, familiar ones. Men speaking not of conquest, but of whether the wheat would last the season, of whether the neighbor's ox had healed. The small matters that make up the architecture of a quiet life. That's what the boy, that's where it began. The taste of grain grown with care. The crunch of crust beneath milk teeth. The way food filled the space between silence and speech. Long before he learned how to command, he learned how to chew. And even when the young, crown came, and the trumpets, and the long corridors of conquest, his meals remembered home. Not always, and not exactly, but often enough that the steam rising from a soldier's soup could bring him back, if only for a moment. They say he traveled with cooks. Not for luxury, not entirely, but for memory. Because taste, unlike time, could be summoned on command. A well-made loaf could become a kind of spell, a defense against homesickness, a way to silence fear before battle. And so bread, humble, brown, coarse, followed him. It was flattened for travel, wrapped in cloth, carried next to daggers and letters. Soldiers kept it in pouches tied tight to their belts, sometimes soaked in olive oil, sometimes chewed dry. It was both sustenance and symbol, a piece of home carried across impossible distance. They shared it around fires, not always evenly, but often earnestly, one man tearing his share in half to give to another, a crust becoming currency, proof that you were not alone. In the freezing mornings before a siege, men would reach for it first, not their armor. In the quiet aftermath of battle, it was the first thing passed between trembling hands. When no words came, a loaf could speak. Even in victory, it appeared, laid out on silver platters in tents that smelled of both spice and sweat, surrounded by pheasant and wine and meats unfamiliar to northern tongues. But still, there it was, a circle of barley bread, cut into quarters, handed to a guest as if to say, even kings begin with crumbs. And sometimes, in the rarest hours, he would tear a piece off for himself, sit in silence, chew slowly, remember what it felt like to eat, without being watched. To eat because he was human, not because he was legend, the crust crackling, the center soft, the bite just a little too dry. But that was how it had always been. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. In those moments, the world seemed smaller, less grand, but more reachable, less of a thing to conquer and more of a place to exist within, a place where people still lit fires, still grew wheat, still broke bread in twilight, and leaned on elbows while talking softly into dusk. He understood. That? He never said it, of course. Not in words carved into stone, but in how he ate, in what he chose to carry with him, the food and the memories hidden inside each bite. Because the bread came before empire. It trained his jaw before his voice. It filled him before his name mattered. It reminded him, in every corner of the world, he later claimed, that even gods must chew. So the next time you hear of a general's glory, or read the names of cities carved in conquest, picture instead a child and a crust, a boy and a morning, a kitchen and a fire long since gone out, because greatness often begins not with gold, but with grain, a quiet breakfast, a cold floor, a slice of barley bread, still warm at its core. And that brings us to Chapter 2, Spice Routes and Salt Roads, where we'll follow what Alexander carried, not on his back, but in his sacks and satchels, where salt meant survival, and spices whispered of lands he had not yet seen. They say armies move on their stomachs, but some stomachs are filled with stories. And Alexander's? His carried more than hunger. It carried rumor, hope, and the soft scent of saffron crushed between fingers under a foreign sun. Long before his men reached distant waters, his journey began with small things tucked carefully into satchels and boxes, salt in tight cloth bundles, peppercorns hidden in wax-sealed jars, dried herbs wrapped like scrolls in oilskin. They were as important to him as armor, perhaps more. These were not luxuries. They were maps drawn in flavor, hints of the world before it unfolded, messages from lands his boots had not yet touched. A kind of culinary prophecy. Salt, the oldest companion, sharp, white, enduring. It preserved meat, cured doubt, steadied the body against the decay of time and distance. In Macedon, they mined it from rock and traded it like treasure. On the road, they tucked it beneath beds of grain to keep rot at bay. In faraway places, it came in crystals the color of dusk, or flakes like snow fallen in hot climates. Salt was not a spice. It was a promise, a way to survive just one more day. then came the others. Cumin, for its warmth, bitter, dry, earthy, a scent like footsteps on sun-baked soil. Fennel, carried for its sweetness. Anise, for its ghost of licorice, useful in wine, and in easing aches. Bay leaves, sometimes crumbled into boiling pots over smoky fires. Coriander, which smelled like green fields even in the heart of dry country. The men did not always know the names. They simply knew what turned the water, from dull to drinkable. What made lamb less lonely on the tongue? What soothed the bitter aftertaste of conquest? These jars and sachets were quiet things. No cheers when they were unpacked, no trumpets for a sprig of thyme. But they carried memory. Home, for some. Mystery, for others. A strange root could feel like a message from a future not yet written, and Alexander understood that. He did not cook, but he watched as cooks lit fires low to the earth, as soldiers sniffed dried leaves skeptically before dropping them into bubbling broths. He knew the power of preparation, that it was not only swords that built allegiance, but the meals shared. On the march, because what you feed your men, you feed your legend, and what you carry in your wagons becomes the shape of your culture. One bite at a time, if he traveled with generals. He also traveled with grinders, mortar bowls, and small ceramic flasks no bigger than fists. He brought vinegar, honey, fermented fish sauce in clay bottles, and once, even a small copper pot filled with cloves, gifted to him by a trader who claimed they came from islands, where the trees bled perfume. Not all of it was useful. Some spoiled. Some were lost in river crossings or left behind in panicked retreats. But enough remained. Enough to flavor the journey. Enough to remind the tongue that life was more than dust and dried meat. And even when marching, one could taste ambition. At night, under soft canopies stretched across wooden poles, cooks would squat over fires and open the spice boxes like sacred texts. Each jar opened released a whisper of mountains or coastlines or markets where people still bartered with. Words instead of weapons. The soldiers gathered, not for ceremony, but for comfort. The scent of simmering stew made the evening feel less strange. Even when the day had taken too much, a friend, a horse, a scrap of hope, the smell of onions. Browning in goat fat could hold them upright just a little longer. Food didn't fix things, but it filled the quiet, and salt and spice, they filled it with meaning. Sometimes the spice routes were actual roads, worn into the earth by centuries of traders long before the Macedonian army passed through. Lines of camels carrying sacks, sewn shut with twine, caravans whispering through desert winds. Alexander's army often marched not into the unknown, but along pathways. Drawn by flavor. They followed the scent, and where they walked, the world changed. Markets grew where soldiers lingered. Dishes mutated, part Greek, part Persian, part dream. The kitchens of the empire became mongrel and magnificent, folding together spices like stories, stirring conquest into cuisine. And still, salt led the way. Rations were counted in weight, but meals were measured in pinches. One pinch to preserve, one to lift the flatness, one to remind the tongue of home. There is a quiet kind of empire hidden in flavor, an empire that does not declare borders, but draws memory into the mouth. Alexander's power stretched across continents, but so did his appetite. And not just for food, for connection, for knowledge, for the invisible maps sketched by trade and taste. Even in retreat, the soldiers carried those jars, not to abandon the dream, but to keep it tucked beside their bodies. A little comfort in chaos. The last bag packed before a hasty departure was often not a sword, but the sack that smelled of basil and vinegar-soaked garlic. Because if you must flee, flee with something that reminds you who you were before the blood and dust. And when they camped again, On some distant plain, beneath stars that spoke a different language, they would light another fire. They would boil another pot. And someone, always, would reach for the salt first. The fingers would pinch it softly. Shake it with care. A ritual as sacred as any prayer. The meal would change. The night would seem less sharp. The belly would quiet. And no one would speak of home, but everyone would remember it. In the cities that welcomed him, or surrendered to him, Alexander bathed, not because he needed to impress, but because the dust of the road is not loyal. It clings to everyone. From the stable boys to the kings, the dust crept into folds of tunics, into nostrils, into wounds half-healed beneath linen. It settled on ambition, dulled the shine of armor, and made no distinction between peasant and conqueror. Bathing was not just indulgence, it was relief. And sometimes it was peace. But these were not private rituals, not behind palace doors. No silver tubs or scented oils reserved for the select few. Not always. Sometimes bathing was done among others, in great stone halls echoing with footfall and low conversation. Steam filled the air like breath. Candles guttered in alcoves. The slap of water against flesh created a rhythm older than empire. Alexander did not always bathe alone. In conquered cities, he often visited their public baths, not to parade, but to observe. And perhaps, just perhaps, to feel what it was like. To be surrounded by men who did not flinch when he entered, who continued their washing, their murmured gossip, their heated debates and playful insults, as if the man beside them had not crossed mountains to be there. In those spaces, the body became just a body again, not a weapon, not a symbol, just skin, soaked and wrinkling with time. Water stripped things, dirt certainly, but also the weight of myth. Even Alexander's scars softened in steam. The baths were carved from stone, but they held more than heat. They held silence, reverence, stories without words. A soldier would rinse his face, eyes closed, and remember his mother's touch. A merchant would scrub his arms, thinking not of coin, but of his daughter's laughter on market mornings. In those pools, grief dissolved without being named. And still, modesty had its choreography. Men faced walls when undressing. Conversations dipped into whispers. Shame wore no toga, but it lingered like steam on the skin. Alexander understood that too. He did not demand space. He claimed presence. There was a difference. The water welcomed all the same. Whether king or cobbler, the temperature did not adjust. He often soaked until the world outside quieted, until the clamor of duty and victory faded into nothing but breath and bubbles. And when he emerged, it was not with grand declarations or dripping gold, but with silence. A towel, a nod, sometimes even a smile. The attendants, trained to be invisible, dried him with quick hands. They smelled of lavender and fatigue. They had dried 1,000 bodies before his, and would dry 1,000 after. His was just another back, another neck, another quiet sigh as warmth left skin and the air returned to cool. In the corners of those bathhouses, lives unfolded. 2 boys practiced wrestling moves behind pillars slick with condensation. An old man combed oil through his beard with fingers that trembled less in the heat. A baker rubbed pumice across calloused feet, wincing, laughing at himself. And in that closeness, in that wet, echoing nearness, people forgot who they were supposed to be. Titles dissolved like soap. No one bowed, no one begged. There were only bodies, clean or nearly clean, moving through heat and hush. Even Alexander, in those moments, seemed smaller, not diminished, just human. He listened to the creak of tile underfoot, to the way men confess things only when submerged to the shoulders, to the low lullabies sung by those scrubbing children at the edges of the bath, to the rhythm of rinsing. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Outside, the streets roared with his name. Inside, the baths forgot it. And perhaps that was the point. Sometimes he brought herbs to drop into the water. A sprig of bay, a slice of lemon peel traded for coin. These were not meant to cleanse. They were meant to soothe. A floating gift to the weary. A scent to hang in the memory like steam in hair. There were baths with ceilings painted like stars, others with nothing above but sky. Some were deep as dreams, others shallow and crowded. But all offered the same exchange: grime for grace, tension for heat, power for presence. On certain evenings, he bathed in silence alongside men who had tried to kill him weeks earlier. The politics ended at the changing room. Inside, there was only the slow art of rinsing. One soldier once said, softly, to a boy who feared entering, "Even the gods must sweat." It was meant to comfort. It did, because sweat was universal. And bathing? Bathing was sacred. No sermons, no shrines. Just warm water and the patience to let it carry things away. Alexander knew that his victories would crumble in time. Cities fall, statues chip, maps fade. But the memory of a warm bath after weeks of dust, that stays. That carves itself into bone. That becomes part of a man's legend in ways no historian can explain. And when the bath was over, when the robes were donned and the night air crept back in, there was a slowness, a softened step. The world did not rush back all at once. It waited. In those few quiet minutes, between heat and hunger, between public and private, a man was allowed to be nothing. And in that nothingness, that small, weightless pause, lived a kind of peace even empires couldn't buy. No trumpets, no scrolls, just the sound of dripping water, wrinkled fingertips, steam rising toward stars that never bowed. To any king, not all dirt is disgrace. Some of it, in Alexander's world, was a kind of metal, a residue of effort, a marker of movement and might. The ash that clung to his soldiers' arms after a long march, it wasn't just soot. It was proof of miles crossed, of fires kindled and extinguished, of nights without shelter and mornings where frost was scraped from the edge of a bowl with a thumb already blistered from labor. Prestige didn't always come polished. Sometimes it walked hand in hand with sweat and the soft gray film of ash. That settled on everything. It was the kind of filth that didn't repel. It impressed. In the camps, men didn't hide their grime. They wore it, like rings on fingers, like creases in hands. They scrubbed it when they could, but more often, they simply nodded at each other's layers. A silent agreement that cleanliness could wait, but survival could not. Even Alexander, draped in fine cloth when the time demanded it, understood the language of sweat. He had trained with the rest. Wrestled, run, lifted and lunged, his skin blistered from the same sun that scorched the backs of stable hands. He smelled like everyone else in summer, sharp, sour, human. The fragrance of motion, not perfume. And ash. Ash was always there, from the fires they used to cook their meals, to the offerings burned before crossing into foreign lands, from the embers of villages, both abandoned and taken. It clung, not just to clothes, but to memory. Ash was the final breath of something spent, wood, food, homes, histories, and yet it was also the beginning of warmth. You needed ash to know there had been fire. The soldiers, when they could, rubbed their skin with ash and oil, a crude ritual learned from. Others passed down without language. Ash drew out sweat, oil softened the skin. Together, they gave a kind of shine, a layer of protection. It wasn't just hygiene. It was preparation for the next day, the next heat, The next moment when your body had to carry more than its share of the burden. Sometimes after battle, men would sit around dying fires, their skin coated in it, streaks of black-gray across forearms, cheeks, shins. No one rushed to wash. They'd let the ash stay until the next river, until the next bathhouse, until the next rain dot, because some kinds of dirt told stories. Alexander watched, and when he could, he took part. Not for show, but for solidarity. To smear ash across the backs of his hands, just as his men did. To know what it felt like to sweat into a tunic already stiff with salt. To press a hand into warm sand and feel the same exhaustion everyone else did. Prestige, he learned, wasn't granted. It was earned in dust and effort. And it often looked nothing like the gleaming statues would later suggest. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. In some cities, especially in the East, rituals around cleanliness were more elaborate. People painted their skin with oils, rinsed with herbal infusions, powdered themselves with fragrant crushed blossoms. Alexander did not scoff at these customs. He studied them, adopted what he liked, adapted what he didn't. He didn't see contradiction in being both ash-covered and adorned. Because power, he understood, was about contrast, not about knowing when to be magnificent and when to be simply part of the dust. On certain nights, he would sit with his closest men, their backs still sticky from heat, the fire low, a silence between them like a thread not yet pulled, and he would look down at his fingernails, black with soot, smell the tang of sweat in the crook of his arm, feel the weight of it, the reality of flesh beneath history, and he would not clean it away, right then. He would let it stay, let it speak, because filth, sometimes, was the only honest thing. It had no agenda, no disguise. It was what happened. When you pushed too far, carried too much, cared more than was reasonable, the ones who were always clean, he did not fully trust them. There was a kind of distance in perfection, a silence that didn't sweat, but those who reeked of effort, who bore ash not as burden, but as badge. He called them brother. He trusted their hunger, their hands, their hearts. The prestige of dirt is not in its appearance, but in its origin. What? Fire made it. What body bore it? What story it tells without speaking. And when finally they reached a town with baths, with linen, with soap, with scented oil, they did not rush to shed the grime. They did it slowly, like releasing a story, one smear at a time, like saying goodbye to the miles that got them there, because even ash deserves a farewell, even sweat deserves to be remembered. And so, if you ever wonder what greatness smells like, it's not always jasmine or myrrh. Sometimes it smells like bodies baked in sunlight, like shirts dried on backs instead of clotheslines, like skin rubbed raw by rope and rain. It smells like ash. It smells like effort. It smells alive. There is a special kind of silence that only comes after fire, not when it dies, but when it settles, when the flames stop snapping like impatient children and instead fold into themselves, glowing low and orange, casting soft halos on faces too tired to speak. That was the silence around Alexander's campfire. Not always, not for show, but in rare moments when the stars had crept above the dust and the next day's march was just far enough, away to be forgotten for a while. He sat, cross-legged, cloaked, close enough to the warmth to feel it in his chest. He did not speak as a king. He did not issue orders or recite visions. He listened to the crackle, to the wind nudging embers, to the breath of men who had followed him through mud and blister and loss, and who, in this light, looked not like warriors, but simply like people trying to get warmed. This was not the fire of speeches. This was the fire of soup, of small laughter, Of boots removed, stretched toward heat, soles worn thin by mountains. The food cooked here was not royal. Lentils, mostly. Crushed garlic. Sometimes dried meat shaved fine and added to thicken the broth. It bubbled and mattered. Pots slung low over firestones, stirred with sticks too bent to be called spoons. And yet, in the right light, it felt sacred, because this was the one place where rank curled up and took a nap. The men sat where there was space. Some slouched. Some cleaned blades with the edge of their tunics. One man always fell asleep with his hands still wrapped around a bowl. And Alexander, he did not need a throne to be known here. They knew him by the way he sat. Still, present, not hovering. Just there. Sometimes he passed bowls. Once he sliced bread with a rusted knife and handed it piece by piece down the line like a farmer serving sons. The fire did something to him, not softened, not humbled, just clarified. If you saw him then, with soot on his sleeve and lentils clinging to his wrist, you might have thought he was no different than the rest. But that was the trick of firelight. It made emperors look like men, and men like something more. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. No. Records survive what was said around those flames. That's because it wasn't history. It was something. Older. Older than books. Older than conquest. The oldest ritual there is, people sitting near warmth after doing hard things, sharing silence as if it were wine, laughing at nothing in particular, letting the food ease the spaces inside them that couldn't be touched by anything else. Sometimes Alexander spoke, quietly, a joke, a story from before, something about his horse, or a time he fell, or a night in the palace as a boy when the bread was burned and he cried even though no one saw. Men didn't interrupt him, not out of fear, but because they didn't want to. Don't interrupt a flame when it flickers low and honest. They listened. And then someone would grunt, or laugh, or offer a story in return. Nothing grand, just a memory. The kind that only shows up when the belly is full, and the air smells of wood smoke. These were not the feasts, sung about in poems. There were no gold cups or roasted boar on silver trays. There were just bowls and bruises, bread and cracked knuckles, feet wrapped in cloth, eyes red from wind. And the fire, the one constant that turned all of it into something bearable. The emperor's campfire was not always central. Sometimes it was tucked between carts, other times built hastily near the sigil. Edge of camp, shielded from wind by a leaning piece of canvas and a pile of helmets. But it always found him, or he found it, because even he, especially he, needed a place where no one expected greatness. Where he could taste his food without ceremony, where he could remember that he was tired, and that being tired was allowed. And when the fire sank to embers and the bowls were scraped clean, the men didn't rush away. They lingered. One more story, one more sip of watered wine, one more minute of pretending that tomorrow didn't exist. And in that pause, Alexander would stand, quietly, not to command, just to walk, maybe to his tent, maybe to the edge of the world he had not yet taken, maybe just into the dark for a moment alone, and the fire would crackle behind him, not with applause, but with acknowledgement. A flame does not cheer. It simply continues. And so did he. Not because of destiny or fate, but because of nights like this, where he remembered why. The walking mattered, where he saw in the smoke not empires, but the outline of something smaller, softer, human, a circle of men, a pot of soup. And the quiet dignity of eating with those who follow you not for glory, but because, in your silence, they hear themselves. Not all battles were fought with blades. Some were staged in candlelight, across wide tables draped in fabric too fine for the dust outside, fights hidden inside toasts, wars softened into wine. These were the banquets of diplomacy. Not quite peace, but the rehearsal of it. And the flicker of flame, and the clatter of dishes. Alexander often met the eyes of men who, days before, had plotted his death. Their fingers curled around goblets instead of hilts now. Their mouths shaped words instead of war cries. And between them, food. Lamb slow-cooked in spices unfamiliar to Macedonian tongues. Bowls of rice jeweled with pomegranate seeds. Platters of figs still dusted with bloom. Everything rich. Everything deliberate. Nothing served by accident. Every flavor had intention, because a meal, in those moments, was more than sustenance. It was strategy. The first bite? A gesture. The second? A signal. The third? A test of whether a man would keep eating or stand. Alexander understood the power of the table. He knew that olive oil could smooth more egos than rhetoric. That cinnamon on roasted dates could soften the voice of a rival. That generosity, when plated well, tasted like mercy, even if it was a leash. The banquet room was theater, and the food, a cast of characters. Meats spoke of wealth, wines hinted at alliances, and dessert, dessert was a dream spun in syrup, an offering of sweetness to cover what bitterness might still linger on the tongue. He didn't always eat much, but he tasted everything, one bite of each dish. A silent nod to the culture that prepared it. A message that said, I see you. And yet, beneath the warmth, everything was careful. The taster always came first, sampling each plate with a blank expression, waiting for nothing to happen. Everyone watched him more than they watched the king, because not all poison comes in powder. Some smiles carry it just fine. Still, Alexander smiled back. He clinked cups. He toasted. He let his fingers trail along the rim of his plate, while others laughed too loudly. He understood that laughter was a weapon, too, a way to fill space where truth might have bloomed. And all the while, the food kept coming. Steam rising like incense. Aromas curling between gold and silver. Flatbreads stacked like parchment scrolls. Goat roasted until it fell apart with a sigh. Chickpeas crushed and spiced, carried in bowls shaped like small ships. They brought him fish, pulled from rivers he had not yet seen. They brought him eggs, dyed and polished, each one a fragile promise. And in return, he gave them calm. That was the trade. Not land, not silver, but the calm that comes when a conqueror breaks bread at your table instead of your gate. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. He learned, over time, the textures of trust. Some men chewed slowly when lying. Some reached too often for wine. Some never touched the plate they had praised seconds before. Alexander noticed these things, not because he feared betrayal, though he did, but because he knew how thin the crust of civility could be. Beneath it, always was hunger. Hunger. For safety, for control, for a return to what once was. He couldn't give them that, but he could give them dinner. And in that offering, in the roasted pheasant, in the preserved lemon, in the flick of honey on the tongue, he could say, I am not just steel. I am stomach. I am scent. I am someone who needs to eat, just like you. It worked. More often than not, some hosts left the meal with softer voices. Some defected. Some wept. One, a prince from a hill fort, said only, No one has ever eaten my bread and let me speak after. That, Alexander believed, was victory. Not banners, not bronze. But permission. And yet, there were banquets that failed, where no one touched the meat, where every dish sat steaming and untouched, as if poisoned not by ingredients, but by grief. A daughter lost. A city burned. A wound too fresh for forgiveness. In those rooms, Alexander ate anyway, slowly, respectfully, sometimes alone, because he knew diplomacy was not always a two-way road. Sometimes you walk it until your feet bleed, and no one meets you at the other. But still, you set the table. Still, you light the fire. Still, you offer figs. Because even if peace cannot be made, dignity can be offered. And there is dignity in the meal. The quiet way rice soaks up broth, the sound of pouring wine, the gesture of placing bread in another's hand, palm open, fingers relaxed. And when the plates were cleared, and the smoke from candles traced lazy spirals toward dark ceilings, Alexander would stand. Not to declare anything, but to nod. The meal was the message. And long after he left, after the rugs were rolled, the platters scrubbed, the echoes stilled, people remembered. Not his words, not his face, but the food. And the silence. And the single steaming ball passed from one table to another. Like hope. Some places are not found on maps. They're discovered in silence. Siwa was one of those. A whisper of a place at the edge of exhaustion. Not quite oasis, not quite kingdom. Just enough shade to believe in rest. Just enough water to believe in mercy. Alexander did not storm this place. He arrived like someone following a dream, not an army. Dust on his lips, vision in his chest. Seeking not a battle, but a voice. The oracle of Ammon waited, hidden in rock and wind. They say the god spoke there, in riddles, in stillness, in ways no empire could conquer. And before that voice, there was a meal. Not grand, not even planned, but it happened just the same. Under a canvas stretched between two olive trees, he sat. The road behind him was long and lean, and his men, parched, blistered, squinting into heat, could only sit quietly and blink. In that kind of light, even talking feels heavy. So they shared what they had. Flatbread crumbled from satchels, too long in the sun. Olives bruised and oversalted. A handful of dates. A leather flask of wine, warm and sour. And honey, golden, thick, hidden in a ceramic jar, wrapped in wool. Someone had been saving it. For a better moment. This, they decided without words, was the better moment. The honey was passed first. Fingers sticky, cheeks flushed. It melted into bread, soaked into grain. It softened the sharpness of survival. Even the quietest among them smiled. And Alexander? He drank wine. Not greedily, not ceremonially. Just enough to let it settle on his tongue. Sharp, dusty, earthy. It tasted like the edge of something, like an answer you almost hear. And perhaps that was fitting, because the oracle would not shout. It would murmur. The meal was not about hunger. It was about readiness. Because before you ask a god a question, you must taste the world's sweetness and its sting. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. That afternoon, the sun didn't relent. It pressed on shoulders like judgment. Flies hovered. Sweat fell in rivulets. Still they ate, slowly, chewing as though it might summon something sacred. And perhaps it did. There is an intimacy to eating with those who have walked with you to the edge of nowhere. No battlefield in sight. No gold in reach. Just heat, breath, and food. They didn't toast. They didn't chant. They just passed things gently, from one hand to another. No titles, no armor, just people. Pausing. And Alexander, the boy who had eaten barley bread in Macedon, a man who had tasted Persian lamb on silver trays, now let date flesh linger between his teeth, now dipped his finger into honey and drew a slow circle in the dust beside his knee. When he finally rose, he left half his bread behind. That was his offering. Not to the god, exactly, but to the journey. Because sometimes the gods aren't watching for gold or blood. Sometimes they watch how you eat, how you share, how you sit in silence when your tongue is too tired to lie. He walked alone to the temple. No soldiers, no priests. Just the breeze, the stone, the echoes of questions that had been asked for centuries and still had no shape. No. One knows what he heard there. Not exactly. Some say the god named him son. Others say nothing was said at all, just a presence, like the taste of honey on a tired tongue. But when he returned, his face had changed, not with triumph, with stillness, as if something had settled inside him. Not an answer, but a permission. The camp was quiet still. His men had dozed. A few stirred coals, not for food, but for something to do. The jar of honey sat half empty. A wine stain spread like a sunburst on a cloth that had once been white. He did not speak. He sat again, tore off the last piece of bread, ate it without looking up, because some truths are not declared. They're digested. Later, he would march again. Later, he would conquer again. But Siwa, and that meal before mystery, stayed in his blood, in his silence, in the way he tasted every bite a little longer after that, because what you eat before a god listens matters. You can measure conquest in miles, in cities taken, in blood, but Alexander's empire was also measured in fruit, not coins, not scrolls, not even swords, but apricots ripened in valleys no Macedonian had ever seen. Pomegranates cracked open under foreign skies. Figs bursting sun-warmed, with skins that tore at the gentlest touch. These were the real trophies. They arrived slowly, not in parades, but in baskets. Carried by cooks, by traders, by trembling fingers unsure if what they held was safe to eat. Or sacred. The first time a soldier bit into a mango, he blinked like someone waking from a dream. The juice ran down his chin, sticky and strange. He wiped it away and smiled like a child, because victory, sometimes, tastes like sweetness. You didn't expect. This was the other story of empire, not the one carved into stone, but the one passed hand to hand in fruit markets, in village kitchens, in the dusty palms of a man who had never seen a lemon before and couldn't stop sniffing its skin. These were fruits of conquest, but not stolen. Adopted. And carried forward. Not by decree, but by desire. Because once you've tasted something that bright, you do not forget it. Alexander tasted them too, not always first, often last. He let his men take the first bites, watched their reactions, laughed when one winced at sourness, asked quiet questions about the seeds, held each one in his hand like it contained the future. He didn't just want land. He wanted what the land tasted like. In the mountains, they found wild mulberries. In the valleys, oranges so small they fit inside a curled fist. Dates, of course. Raisins dried and packed tight in waxy bundles. But also stranger things. Gourds with meat like sugar, melons with skins that shimmered like fish. He rarely ate much, but he remembered every flavor. And the cooks, those tireless, smoke-stung magicians, they experimented. They took the fruits of one place and matched them with the spices of another. They stewed peaches with cardamom, wrapped figs in roasted vine leaves, blended citrus into lentils to ease the weight of salt. The empire was not just expanding. It was blending. On the plate and in the mouth. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Some soldiers resisted. They missed the barley, the goat cheese, the solid, honest heft of home food. They called the new fruits strange, unmanly, even. Too soft. But then came the fever days, when only fruit could be kept down, when citrus cut through the ache of thirst, when a handful of grapes brought more comfort than a healer's chant. That's when they understood. These fruits didn't just belong to the conquered. They belonged to the tired, to the sick, to the hopeful. And Alexander, though never sick, ate them during such days too, quietly, chewing each bite with thought, not urgency, as if trying to decode the land through taste. He never said much about it, but the fruit stayed. They began carrying it with them, wrapped in cloth, hung from saddlebags, tucked between weapons and scrolls. When they camped, they traded slices like secrets. When they passed through markets, they searched for new kinds. When they rested near rivers, they fished with one hand and peeled citrus. With the other, food was no longer just fuel. It was discovery, and it gave them something the battlefield never could: wonder, even in war. A plum can surprise you, even in conquest. A cherry pit can feel like a gift. And in the quiet of the night, when the fires died and only the soft crunch of dried fruit remained, they felt not full, but soothed. Because sweetness. Soothes. One night, under a crescent moon, a soldier handed Alexander a pear, small, misshapen, brown around the edges. He took it. Bit into it, chewed slowly, and said only this: "It tastes like something from before." No one asked what he meant, but everyone understood, because in every bite of something new, there is something old, something familiar, hidden in the flavor. Like memory. Like home, or the idea of it. That's what fruit gave them. Not just nutrients. Not just trade, but a reminder that life could still surprise. That the world, though often cruel, still offered sweetness to those who paid attention. The next day, they would march again. The wind would burn their faces. The sun would blister their backs. But someone, somewhere in the ranks, would be carrying an orange. And in that pocket of juice and scent, something human remained untouched by empire. Victory doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like sitting at a table that isn't yours, eating food made by hands you never met, drinking from cups polished by people who prayed you'd never arrive. This was the strange silence that followed Alexander after Darius fell, not on the battlefield, but in absence. In what was left behind, rooms still warm with memory, kitchens that still smelled of cardamom, doors that closed a little too softly. He did not celebrate. Not in the way songs pretend. He walked through the palace carefully, slowly, as if Darius might still be there, just around the corner, preparing to greet him, or challenge him, or sit across from him in bitter politeness, each man pretending not to calculate every bite. But Darius was gone. And so Alexander sat alone. In a hall too large for solitude, pillars lined like guards, cushions soft enough to make a conqueror feel small. The meal had already been prepared, not for him. For Darius, roasted lamb glistened in its own juices, rice fluffed with saffron, stewed apricots still steaming, bread stacked high, as if no one had told the kitchen the world had changed. And maybe that was the truth of empire. It moves faster on naps than in the heart. So Alexander sat and ate, not greedily, not awkwardly. Just with awareness. Every bite carried memory he did not own. He chewed Darius' dinner, drank from Darius' goblet, tasted the wine someone else had chosen to soothe a different kind of weariness. And still, he stayed quiet, because ghosts eat with you when you take their place. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The servants did not meet his eyes. They moved around him like smoke, trained in grace, in silence, in the deep and weary art of surviving change. He let them work. He let the food arrive as it would have before. As if nothing had shifted but the shape of the man at the table. Fig was placed before him, split, drizzled with honey. He stared at it a moment, longer than he meant to, and then ate it whole, a gesture of respect, or perhaps surrender. He did not mock the man, whose seat he now filled. He wondered about him. What did Darius taste when he bit into that? Fig? Did he close his eyes? Did he think of gardens? Of mothers? Of a son, watching from some window Alexander hadn't yet found? He ate slowly, chewed with attention, because power, when inherited like this, tastes different. It is not cooked in your own kitchens. It is handed to you, hot, heavy, unfamiliar. And still, you must eat. After all, the body doesn't care whose food it is, only that it comes. The rice was light, spiced just right. A lamb fell apart at the edge of his spoon. It was, by all measures, a perfect meal. And yet, it sat oddly in his stomach. Not badly, just uncomfortably. As if the food knew it was being mourned. As if the walls remembered other conversations. Quieter voices. Laughter that wasn't forced. Even the fire in the brazier crackled differently, like it had stories to tell, but didn't know who was listening now. Later, he rose, not abruptly. He wiped his hands, drank water from a silver cup, thanked the servants, not with words, but with his gaze, one steady look that said, "I know this isn't mine." Then he walked out through the hall of Colonnades, past the fig trees still heavy with fruit, into a garden that was, by night, too fragrant to be real. And still, Darius followed, not in form, but in feeling, the ghost of someone whose plate had not yet cooled, whose fingers still lingered, invisibly, over the back of a carved wooden chair. Alexander did not banish the ghost. He invited it. Let it walk beside him in silence, because some meals are shared long after they're served, and some victories are haunted, not by guilt, but by grief. He never said the name aloud. Again, not that night, not in the days after. But the kitchen never changed. It still made apricot stew, still baked the bread the same, still salted the lamb just so. And Alexander, for a while, kept eating. It. Not as a thief, not as a god, but as someone trying to understand a man by finishing his last meal. Borders are not always marked by walls. Sometimes they are drawn in flavor. And before Alexander ever saw India's rivers or its emerald hills, he tasted its edge, not through battle, but through a feast. It happened near the frontier, a place where the air felt different, thicker, more fragrant. A wind that carried whispers of spices even before the ground did. The soil was redder here. The trees bent more gently, and the firewood burned with a scent no Macedonian could name. The soldiers felt it in their tongues before they felt it in their boots. This land was other. And that night, with tents staked in foreign earth and stars they didn't recognize overhead, a feast was set, not out of celebration, but anticipation. No one knew what waited beyond the hills, but everyone knew they would need strength to meet it. And so, the cooks, those quiet architects of morale, lit their fires early and cooked longer than usual. The food came slowly. Flatbreads, thinner than any before, blistered at the edges from hot stones. Rice, long, fragrant, steamed in linen-wrapped bundles. Chickpeas mashed with something sharp and green. And meat, tender, marinated, roasted until it sighed apart. There were sauces, 2 bright ones, with turmeric and tamarind, with garlic, and ground coriander. They poured them cautiously, as if unsure whether they were seasoning or spell. Alexander arrived last, not because he demanded it, but because he always waited. Let his men settle first. Let the mood rise without his presence weighing it down. When he entered, the laughter quieted, not out of fear, but reverence. He nodded once, sat on a cushion already dusted with breadcrumbs, rolled up his sleeves, accepted the bowl offered, to him with both hands. And he ate, no words, no toast, just slow, steady chewing. Just the sound of a feast learning its rhythm. He had eaten many meals, in palaces, in tents, on horseback, in silence, in sorrow. But this one was different, because this meal was a doorway, and every bite felt like a step across it. If you are enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The men were quiet, at first, not out of solemnity, but curiosity, their mouths full of new, their tongues searching for names they didn't know. The food was strange, but not hostile, spiced, but not cruel. It was a welcome in edible form, and they understood. This land spoke a language you could taste. They reached for seconds. They broke bread and used it to scoop sauce. They licked their fingers. They laughed again, and in that moment, fear took a small step back, because fear cannot sit beside fullness for long. Alexander took note of the dishes his men returned to, of the ones that made their eyes widen, of the silence that came after a particularly good bite. He asked one cook about the yellow sauce. The man didn't know its name, only that it was made with roots pulled from riverbanks, ground fine, mixed with oil, and stirred until it smelled like sun. That was enough. The feast lasted longer than any they had since crossing into Persia, not because of gluttony, but because of gratitude. And time seemed to slow around the firelight. Even the wind softened. Even the embers leaned closer. And when it came time for sweet things, they did not have much. Just sugared nuts, a syrup made from boiled fruit and spice. But it was enough to close the night. The soldiers leaned back, hands on their bellies, eyes half-lidded. And in that collective exhale, something shifted. It wasn't just that they were full. It was that they were willing to keep going, willing to taste what came next. And Alexander, looking into the distance where the trees thickened and the horizon curled, into the unknown, took another bite. He didn't speak prophecy. He didn't claim destiny. He simply tasted. And in that taste, he found resolve. Because sometimes you do not conquer a land. Sometimes you let it feed you first. And in doing so, you understand what it means to belong, even if only for a meal, even if only for a night. Hunger changes the rules, especially when you're far from home, too deep into a land that doesn't know your name, and too proud to admit that you no longer know its rules. This was the slow unraveling that marked Alexander's Indian campaign. Not in strategy, not in strength, but in the stomach. The body, ever honest, spoke louder than any scroll. They had brought what they could, sacks of barley, salted meat, dried lentils curled into small brick-hard clusters, but the stores didn't stretch like the ambition did. The army moved faster than the food. And so they adapted. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. It began with observation. Villagers crushing seeds in stone bowls. Women peeling long, strange fruits and sprinkling them with salt. Children plucking herbs that looked like weeds, but smelled of citrus and fire. The Macedonians watched. Then copied, then tasted, cautiously, at first. Every bite an experiment. Every flavor a negotiation between curiosity and caution. Some were revelations. Coconut milk, drawn from a hairy orb that looked more like a weapon than food, tasted like sweetness rescued from thirst. Mangoes, sliced open, revealed golden flesh, so soft it fell from the skin like silk. Jackfruit, strange, spiny, massive, tore into threads of meatless meat, dense and fragrant. Others were harder to love. There were roots that numbed the tongue. Dishes so fermented they hissed when opened. Small, biting fruits that seemed to carry fire in their pulp. But hunger is a teacher. And over time, the men learned. To mix, to mash. 2. Balance sour with salt, and heat with rice dot to chew slowly. Not out of politeness, but because rushing meant surprise, and not always the good kind. Alexander tried everything. He was never above the plate. He bit into raw turmeric and sneezed. For a full minute. Laughed afterward. Asked for more, but just a sliver. He drank broth made from tamarind and chili and declared it angry soup, then finished the bowl. He called food by names he made up. Not mockingly, but because naming made it familiar. Night, a dish of fermented rice and mustard seed, arrived at his feet. He looked at it, stirred it, sniffed, then turned to a soldier and said, "You first." The man obeyed, chewed, blinked. "It tastes like a wet argument." He said, Alexander ate anyway. "If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Because taste is not about comfort, about experience." And Alexander wanted to taste the land. Even when the land pushed back, there were moments of resistance. Men who refused to eat, who curled their noses, who longed for the flat, bland safety of home. But there were also converts, soldiers who began grinding spices before dawn, who bartered for coriander leaves, who boiled lentils with local onions and called it stew, though it barely resembled what they knew. The food became a map, a way to trace the invisible borders of the empire they were chasing, not through lines on parchment, but through heat, texture, and the unpredictable comfort of flavor in some places. Food came with story. A village elder offered Alexander a sweet wrapped in a leaf, said it was meant to be eaten before journeys, that it protected the heart. He didn't explain how. Alexander ate it anyway. Later, he asked what it was called. The translator didn't know, just smiled, shrugged, and said, "It's what they give to those they love." That night, Alexander passed it around to his men. No speech, just a quiet offering, a silent hope that the sweetness meant safety. Some kept the leaf, didn't eat it, just tucked it into their belts like a charm. Not every meal was successful. There were illnesses, days when the food turned, nights when a pot spoiled and the entire camp groaned in rhythm. Medicinal teas were brewed, bitter, sharp, effective. Sleep came with a price those nights. But even then, the hunger returned, because the body never stops asking. Even when the world grows strange, even when nothing tastes like memory. Alexander came to believe that conquering a land meant learning to eat it, not just feed from it. And so he ate every root, every seed, every reluctant bite, not to prove strength, but to prove trust. Because trust, like appetite, grows when shared. And though he longed for the simplicity of barley bread, he also knew you cannot walk new soil and expect it to taste like home. You must let it change you. Let it coat your teeth with new oils. Let it stain your fingers with colors your mother never taught you to wash off. Let it remind you that even a god, even a king, even the son of thunder and ambition must chew. Rain has its own kind of hunger. It doesn't empty the stomach. It slows it. Makes food colder, slower, quieter. Turns every bite into a small act of perseverance. In India's monsoon, the world became wet in every direction. Not just above, where the sky sagged under its weight, but beneath as well, the ground softened. Into a thick soup of mud and memory. The tents leaked. Boots were forgotten in puddles. And the fires. Oh, the fires struggled. Smoke choked sideways beneath the canvas. Wood refused to catch. Flame died with a hiss, like it had second thoughts. In this wet, endless world, the soldiers moved slower. Their shoulders slouched differently. Bread molded before it was broken. Meat spoiled before it could be salted. Rice clunked and soured. Nothing tasted right anymore. The rain made food sad. It diluted flavor, dampened appetite, made every meal a reminder of what they no longer had: warmth, dryness, simplicity. There were days when the only food that could be cooked was boiled, roots bitter, pale, forgiving only in that they filled space. They called it belly mud, not affectionately. Still, they ate it, because hunger is louder than complaint. And the rain had no interest in stopping. Even Alexander felt it. Not just the wet, but the weight his cloak never dried. His hair dripped into his bowl. Even his silver dishes tarnished from the constant damp. Once, in the middle of dinner, a leak formed directly over his seat. He simply moved the bowl, didn't flinch. He was as soaked as the rest. And still, he sat, ate what they ate. The rain, it turns out, does not recognize rank. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe. If you'd like more nights like this. They tried everything: digging trenches around fires, cooking in shifts, wrapping dry goods in oiled cloth. But the monsoon found its way in, through seams, through boots, through breath. And when the food was gone or spoiled, they foraged, not because they were desperate, not yet, but because they were tired of eating disappointment. Mushrooms that bloomed overnight, suspicious and soft. Wild greens that stung the tongue, but felt good in the belly. Rainwater mixed with tea leaves, plucked from a hillside they did not recognize. Soldier discovered a fruit that grew in clusters beneath heavy trees. Small, yellow, fragrant. He offered it to the cook like a gift from the gods. The cook sniffed it, tasted it, then smiled. For the first time in days, it was sour, but honest. And that night, every pot had a piece of it inside, sliced thin, boiled. Long. It didn't change everything, but it changed the smell. And sometimes a new smell is enough. The soldiers sat in tight circles, shoulders touching, steam rising from bowls held too close to faces. They didn't talk much, just ate, slowly, letting the warmth climb their arms, letting the taste remind them that this too would pass. The rain didn't stop, but for a moment, the world inside the tent felt less cold. Alexander said little, but he noted how the bowls were emptied quicker when the fruit was added. He asked to see the tree the next morning, rode out into the mist with a scout, and stood beneath its dripping branches, picked one himself, peeled it, ate it whole, made a face. Then nodded. "It fights back," he said. "Good, so do we." The men smiled. That night, they gave the fruit a name. Not its real one, no one knew that, but a name that meant something to them. Storm lemon. They carried it in their pockets after that. Bit into it raw when spirits dropped. Used it as seasoning. Gave it to the sick. Gave it to the ones who couldn't rise from their bedding. And somehow, it helped. Because sometimes, the belly doesn't just need food. It needs a reason. And Storm. Lemon was a reason. To believe the rain wouldn't wind out to. Believe the mud would dry. To believe the road would open again. One morning, after days of wet silence, the sun returned. Not boldly. Just a pale beam through gray. The fire caught on the first try. The cook whistled, and someone, no one remembers who, roasted the last of the mushrooms and laced them with lemon and pepper. It was the best meal they had in weeks. Not because of what it was, but because of where they were now, on the other side of the wet. And when Alexander ate that meal, he didn't speak. He just closed his eyes, let it sit on his tongue, and remembered what hunger had taught them. That food is not always joy. Sometimes it is grit. And even the smallest thing, a sour fruit in. The rain can feel like hope if you taste it slowly enough. There were many kinds of kings in the lands Alexander passed through. Some ruled with gold, others with silence. A few with stories too sacred to speak aloud, but many, especially in the East, ruled with restraint. They fasted for clarity, for strength, for closeness to gods who preferred empty stomachs and full minds. Fasting was not weakness. It was power reined in, proof that the body could be denied and the soul would not suffer. Alexander watched them, priests draped in thin cloth, walking barefoot through dust, their bellies hollow as prayer bowls. Princes who refused meat for entire moons. Dignitaries who sat beneath trees with palms, open and mouths shut for days. He respected it, but he did not join them. Because Alexander was not a king who fasted. He ate, quietly, intentionally, not in excess, but with conviction. He believed the body should be fed if it was to carry dreams. He did not mock their rituals. He simply did not share them. At diplomatic tables, he would sip broth while others meditated. He would accept figs with a bowed head while others closed their eyes and turned away. And he never apologized. Because to him, eating was not weakness. It was preparation. He had no interest in punishing the flesh for its needs. He had asked too much of it already. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Some saw this as arrogance, but others, especially the tired ones, saw it as truth. They too were hungry. Hungry not just for food, but for the permission to need it. Alexander gave that permission by example. He chewed with care, swallowed without guilt. Let his men see him savor. Even in sacred spaces, he did not hide his appetite. Once, he was offered a seat beside a holy man who had not eaten in 4 days. The air between them was thick with incense and silence. A bowl of boiled lentils sat untouched between them. A test. Perhaps. Alexander reached for it. Ate with 3 fingers. Did not break. Eye contact. The holy man smiled. You believe in the body? He said. Alexander nodded. And in what it can carry? He answered. The man poured him water. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was full, because belief, like bread, comes in many shapes. Alexander's belief was in motion, in presence, in chewing when the world demanded haste. To fast, for him, was to lie about what it meant to be alive, because the body hungers, and when it's denied too long, it stops whispering and starts screaming. He could not lead men who starved on principle. He could only lead those who nourished themselves enough to lift swords and speak truths. He ate on the battlefield. In between, sprints, on horseback, under trees, in shadows. Between speeches, a handful of nuts, a slice of dried meat, a corner of bread dipped in oil. Never extravagance, but never absence, either. Some mistook it for indulgence, but indulgence is loud, wasteful. Alexander was neither. He simply refused to treat the body as shameful, because a full belly, in his eyes, was a steady hand, and steady hands held nations. Still, he respected the faster's gaze, the discipline, the stillness. He saw its power, but knew it was not his. His was a body of movement, of sweat and salt and need. He fasted only in mourning. Never for insight, because he believed clarity could come from chewing just as much as from silence. One day, a soldier tried to emulate a priest, refused food, sat apart, grew pale. Alexander called him forward, asked him why. To cleanse, the man said. Alexander handed him a warm fig. Cleanse tomorrow, he said. March today. The man nodded, ate. And lived. That was his commandment. March 1st. Eat now, fast later, if there's anything left, because kingdoms do not wait for your stomach to settle, and neither does history. There is holiness in hunger, yes, but there is also holiness in the hand that feeds. In the bowl that returns full. In the body that moves, unpunished. And so, he remained, a king who would not fast, The one who met gods with olive oil on his breath, and crumbs in his lap. Not in defiance, but in reverence for the body that carried him this far, and the food that made it possible. Not every speech begins with words. Sometimes it begins with soup. A golden one, served in a bowl heavy with precious metal, placed on a table already crowded with candles, sweet-smelling steam rising like a gentle proclamation. Alexander understood this long before he learned to conquer. Food, he knew, spoke first, long before the diplomat, long before the scroll. A meal was a message, and in the hands of a king, it became a mirror, a story, a threat, and a promise, all at once. So he crafted his dinners like campaigns, deliberate, symbolic, rich where it needed to be, humble where it surprised. He knew which fruits to include and which to leave out. He knew how many olives spoke generosity and how many suggested greed. He knew that no one truly listens until they're chewing, and no one forgets a meal that made them feel honored or humiliated. His table was a tool, just like his sword, but quieter, more persuasive, often more permanent. The first time he hosted a banquet in Babylon, the table stretched like a river, unending, draped in silks dyed in colors some had never seen. Golden dishes filled with foods the guests didn't recognize. And yet, everything tasted familiar, because that was the trick. To remind people that your power was not just force. It was abundance. It was hospitality. It was the ability to feed people better than they could feed themselves. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe. If you'd like more nights like this, there was no need for shouting. He let the apricot glazed lamb speak. Let the jeweled rice whisper comfort. Let the endless pouring of wine say, you are in the presence of someone who can give without end, or withhold without reason. It wasn't just what was served. It was how the Persians dined reclining. A show of ease. So Alexander reclined too, but not always. Sometimes he sat upright, just to show that he could choose. He adopted local customs, and then outdid them, not to insult, but to absorb, to prove that he wasn't just king of Macedon. He was king of the table too, and that table had no borders. He made the meal the empire. Different breads from different lands, sauces with ingredients from places his guests had only heard in rumor. Every bite a map. The guests ate cautiously at first, eyes wide, fingers hesitant. But food, when good, overcomes suspicion faster than speeches ever do. Soon, laughter returned. Mouths opened, hands reached, and in that warmth, he planted something deeper than loyalty. He planted memory, because long after the war songs fade and the treaties fray, people remember how they were fed. One host served his guests with bare hands, a cultural tradition. One Alexander honored by mirroring. It startled his own men. But to the locals, it meant everything. Another time, he served only vegetarian dishes, honoring a guest's religion, but made them lavish, opulent. A feast of grains and greens and gold-dusted figs. The man wept, said no one had ever made. His restraint feel like royalty. That was the point. Food is not just flavor, it's feeling. And Alexander made sure that what his guests felt was awe, even his enemies, especially them, because he knew no man rises to challenge you after you've shown him the taste of the world you can offer. The banquet room was a battleground, dressed in linen and light, and Alexander won, not with blade, but with baklava. His cooks were instructed carefully, not just to season, but to symbolize. Dishes had purpose. A fish served whole, head to tail, meant unity. A roasted bird, served in silence, marked mourning, even if no one said what was being mourned. An overflowing bowl of honeyed dates meant there will be more where this came from. He once served a course entirely made of local ingredients. From the guest's homeland, the man sat stunned, and understood, without a word, that Alexander had not only conquered his land, but tasted it, remembered it, served it back to him improved. That was the message. I have your land. But also, I have honored it, it was genius and dangerous, because food that flatters can also haunt. One man, once a rival, later said that the memory of that meal was worse than the loss of his palace, because it reminded him of what he'd surrendered. Not just power, but pride. That's what Alexander weaponized. Not hunger, but fulfillment. The kind that lingered. The kind that made men question their alliances, their resistance, their sense of self. Not because he forced them to, but because he fed them better than they'd ever fed themselves. And in return, they followed not always willingly, but certainly hungrily, because a full stomach thinks differently than an empty one. And Alexander knew how to fill it in just the right way. Not all hunger ends in satisfaction. Sometimes it ends in silence, in the quiet of tents that once rang with laughter, in the stillness of a man curled around his middle, not from cold, but from rot. The empire moved fast, too fast for the grain to keep dry, too far for the meat to stay sweet, too wide for the cooks to know what waited in every bag and barrel. And so it happened, slowly at first. A stomach turned, a soldier went pale, then still. Someone whispered it was the fish. Someone else swore it was the onions, soft and bruised. From days in the sun, the truth didn't matter. Only the outcome did. The camp slowed. Spoiled stores were uncovered. Sacks of rice clumped into sour bricks. Jars cracked, their contents gone cloudy. Bread molded from the inside out. The vinegar had lost its sting. Even the salt tasted wrong. There was no battle that day. Only the steady sound of retching. Alexander walked among them, face unreadable. He carried no sword, only a waterskin. Offered it to those who could still lift their heads. He did not flinch at the smell, not because he was strong, but because shame has no place in survival. And sickness is survival gone sideways. He ordered. Fires built, not for warmth, but for boiling. Pots scrubbed. Hands washed. Rations inspected by lamplight. Anything suspect was burned, no questions. But even fire cannot cook safety into everything. Some sickness lingered. And with it came doubt. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The cooks, those quiet heroes, looked ashamed, but Alexander did not blame them. He blamed the distance, the damp, the desperation of trying to stretch old food into new days. He blamed the rain that seeped through oiled cloth, the heat that turned dates into syrup too soon, the rodents who snuck past sleeping guards, leaving waste in sacks no one checked. He did not shout. He set an example. Ate only what had been cooked that day. Refused wine if it hadn't been sealed. Tasted the broth before anyone else. And once, when a servant hesitated to bring him food, fearing it might still be tainted, he ate it anyway. Slowly. In full view. Not because he was fearless, but because someone had to go first. He spent that night curled beside the fire, not because he was sick, but because others were, and they felt better knowing he was close. Sometimes, a full stomach means nothing when fear has already taken root. And the men feared, not death, but the slow betrayal of their own bellies, the way the body turns against you with no warning. How something once trusted, bread, fish, figs, becomes enemy. They ate less, then not because they had to, because they were afraid. That's when the true hunger set in. Not the kind you fix with food, but the kind that wears you down, bite by bite. Alexander didn't try to convince them. He simply waited, waited for the smells to return. Garlic, roasting grain, stew thickened properly. Waited for someone to chew without flinching. Waited for laughter around a pot again. It came back. Slowly. With fresh stores. Carried at great cost. With lemons and vinegar to cut through the bad. With herbs that disguised the memory of sickness just long enough to make space for taste. And the first soldier to finish his meal without pause earned a cheer. Not a loud one. Just a soft clap of spoons. A bowl passed around. A nod. That was the beginning of healing. The food, by then, had changed. Simpler. Blunter. Fewer spices. Fewer risks. But there was something honest in it. A bowl of boiled barley. A slice of salted goat. Handful of pickled radish. Sharp enough to make your eyes water. Nothing elegant. Nothing clever. Just meals that stayed down. That didn't trick the belly. It whispered, "You are safe here." Alexander took note. He marked which dishes were eaten fully, and which ones still returned half-touched. He asked the cooks to keep logs, not of recipes, but of reactions. Not what fed the body, but what fed trust. And in time, the fear faded. The smells returned. So did the appetite, because the stomach remembers everything. But it also forgives. Eventually. History doesn't always. Write down the hands that stirred the pot. It remembers battles, dates, the flash of gold on a general's chest. But rarely the woman bent over a smoky fire, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, brow damp, feeding an empire one ladle at a time. She was never named. Not in scrolls, not in songs, but she was there. Perhaps in Babylon, perhaps earlier. Maybe she joined the march as a captive, or as a servant, or simply because she had no place else to go. But what mattered more than her name was her skill. Because even conquerors must eat. And Alexander, who could command cities with a glance, trusted her to command his plate. She was not old, nor especially young, just certain. The kind of woman whose quiet confidence fills a room, more than a trumpet could. She didn't bow too low. She didn't speak unless spoken to. But her food spoke in volumes no translator could ever match. Each morning, before the tents rustled and the horses stirred, she was already awake, grinding spice, measuring rice by feel, not by cup, tasting broth with the same spoon she used to stir. A private ritual, unseen by the men who would later praise the meal as if it had made itself. She knew what Alexander liked, but more than that, she knew what he needed. On days when his jaw tightened before dawn, she kept the food soft. Nights when he returned bloodied, or tired, or more silent than usual, she added sweetness. A spoonful of honey. A slice of fig tucked into grain. She cooked like someone listening to emotions, not orders. And in her hands, food became more than fuel. It became care. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more. Nights like this, she didn't sit at the king's table. Of course not. She sat behind the curtain, near the fire, cleaning lentils or peeling something sour. Her hands always moving, never idle. But her ears, always, tuned to the mood of the room. She could hear when tension brewed, could smell when appetite vanished, and when needed, she changed the menu without asking. Alexander never questioned it. He once asked who had added coriander to his stew. The flavor had caught him off guard. She did, a servant replied, nodding toward the tent's edge. He said nothing, just kept eating. Slowly. The next day, coriander was served again, not as a test. As trust, because trust in a camp where alliances could shift with a glance was rare, and a meal that never betrayed you, that was loyalty in edible form. Her food never betrayed. Not once. And though she never sought credit, she noticed who returned their bowls clean, who asked for seconds, who offered a quiet nod as they passed by her tent, even if they never said her name. She kept a list in her mind, not of rank, but of need. Which soldier needed more salt? Which general couldn't stomach garlic? Which boy from Thrace missed goat milk and softened whenever she could provide a cup? And yes, even what Alexander needed, though he never asked for anything aloud. Once, after days of harsh marching, he collapsed near the fire, boots still on, eyes dull. She brought him lentils with lemon and soft bread. He said nothing, ate with one hand, staring into the coals. Afterward, he whispered, "That tastes like my mother's patience." She nodded. Said nothing, just took the bowl and walked away. That was her power. Not in words, but in warmth. And not just warmth from the food, warmth from knowing how to give without demanding thanks. Others tried to learn from her. Young girls, sometimes. Boys, too. Sent to help, to chop, to carry. She taught with glances, with gestures, never raised her voice, never scolded. But everyone knew when they got it wrong, and everyone remembered when they got it right. When Alexander fell ill, not gravely, just enough to go pale and silent, she brewed a tea from mint and lime and something no one else could name. He drank it, woke up better, never asked what was in it, because some things aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be trusted. When the army moved on, she moved with them. Her feet were blistered, her fingers cracked from heat, her eyes ringed with soot. But still, every evening, the fire was lit. And food was served. And Alexander ate, not as a king taking tribute, but as a man receiving kindness. Her name is lost, but her legacy is not, because every meal that soothed, every dish that calmed, every bowl that reminded someone of a better time, those were her monuments, not carved in stone, but carved in memory. And even empires, for all their power, are built on memory. Homesickness doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly. Not in tears or in speeches, but in the stillness between bites, in the pause before swallowing, in the soft ache that comes when a meal is almost ripe, but not quite. The salt is different. The bread doesn't tear the same. The oil smells too sharp, or too soft, or just wrong. And suddenly, you're not hungry anymore. Not because you're full, but because your stomach remembers something your tongue can't find. Alexander knew this, not just in his men, but in himself. He had tasted across continents, stews that simmered with stars above, flatbreads folded over campfires in foreign wind, fruits that bled colors no painter could match. But still, there were nights when he longed for something simpler: barley bread, goat cheese, the bite of a sour fig plucked too early, eaten anyway because you couldn't wait. These were not delicacies. They were roots, and every soldier, from the youngest squire to the grizzled veteran with knees that cracked like branches, carried their own version of this hunger. A taste, a scent, a memory. And sometimes, by luck or mercy, it returned. Not in whole, but in whisper. A spice from home traded at a market stall. A grain cooked just the right way by a cook who'd listened closely. And suddenly, there it was, the scent of home carried on steam. It didn't matter if the pot was dented or the fire was struggling. In that moment, everything softened. Voices lowered. Hands steadied. Bites slowed, because they weren't just eating food. They were tasting something they'd thought was lost. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. One soldier wept, quietly, over a bowl of lentils, not because of the taste, exactly, but because the texture reminded him of a winter evening in a village no one else had heard of. Another held a roasted onion to his face for a full minute before eating it. My mother used to burn them just like this, he said. He didn't smile when he said it, but he didn't cry either. Alexander noticed. He noticed everything. He didn't speak of homesickness, didn't allow it to become a sickness at all. But he permitted it in food. Allowed the cooks to recreate dishes from the past, even if imperfect. Encouraged trade with locals to find familiar herbs. Sometimes even stopped the march early so something could be cooked right, not fast, because morale isn't built in speeches. It's built in broth. He asked men about their childhood foods, not to manipulate, but to understand. He wanted to know what made them feel real again, not strong, just themselves. And when the meals began to reflect the past, even slightly, the change was visible. The men sat straighter, laughed sooner. Some cleaned their bowls with bread, a habit long forgotten. One night, a cook managed to mimic a northern stew, using lamb, cumin, and a kind of wild grain that grew along a nearby river. No one said it was exact, but no one cared. It was close enough to remind them they were once boys in warm kitchens, close enough to make silence feel like safety. Alexander, that night, asked for seconds. He didn't usually, but he did then. And said nothing while eating. Just looked into the fire with eyes that weren't looking at war. Afterward, he thanked the cook. Not with praise. With a question. Can you make it again? The cook said yes, even though he couldn't. Not exactly. The herbs were already gone. The lamb wouldn't last, but he'd try, because that's what food became in the belly of empire. Not sustenance, but effort, attempt, a gesture that said, "You are not forgotten." And even the wrong taste, made with care, can feel like home. Some began saving ingredients, a bit of salt, a pinch of spice, a clove of garlic wrapped in linen. They carried these not for flavor, but for memory. Tiny treasures, seeds of the past. One soldier kept a single dried plum tied to his belt, not to eat, just to hold, just to smell when the road grew too long. Another snuck a crust of bread into his pack every morning, not out of hunger, but out of habit, a superstition, as if carrying it meant the day would go softer. And sometimes it did, because the scent of home, even when faint, holds the power to soften the hardest day. To warm the coldest night. To remind a marching man that he is more than his footsteps. He is someone's son, someone's memory, someone who once had breakfast without fear. And that is enough. Some meals are not made to satisfy. They are made to remember. To hold grief gently between bites. To sit with silence at a table set for more than are present. To chew without appetite, because not eating would feel worse. That this was the meal after Hephaestion died. Alexander did not speak. He did not shout, did not march, did not write. He sat in a room filled with food and felt nothing. The platters were full. Roasted meats lacquered with honey and spice. Trays of fruit still cold from morning shade. Bread stacked high as walls. It had all been prepared before the news arrived. Too late to stop. Too painful to waste. So they served it anyway. And Alexander sat at the center of it, in silence, while the fire popped and the plates steamed, and the room pretended not to weep. No one touched the lamb. No one touched the wine. A fig split open on a silver dish, its seeds glistening like tears. And across from him, no one. Only the space where Hephaestion should have been. A chair, a cup, a folded napkin never used. They say he tore the tablecloth, that he sat for hours without blinking, that he chewed one piece of bread until it dissolved. What is certain is this: the food was not eaten, but it was remembered, because morning has its own kind of hunger. It does not growl. It does not ask. It simply sits, heavy in the chest, hollow in the gut. And demands presence. Alexander remained at that table longer than any battle, not out of ceremony, but because moving would mean accepting the space left behind. If you're enjoying this pace already, Leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The kitchen grew quieter after that. Not by order, but by instinct. Spices were used less. Meals became plainer. Meats were boiled, not roasted. Bread was left unbuttered. Stews were thinned out, not because there was less to give, but because the appetite had changed. The cooks didn't ask what the king wanted. They simply gave him food that did not argue with sorrow. Warm milk, soft barley, pomegranates, cut and left open, untouched, and still he ate, not because he was hungry, but because the body must go on. Even when the heart halts. One night, a small bowl of lentils was placed before him. No garnish, no salt. He stared at it for a long time, then took a spoon and stirred once, and once more. And then ate. Slowly. As if the memory of a friend might be found in the bottom of the bowl. His men noticed. And followed, not in grand gestures. But in smaller ways. They ate in silence, passed dishes with reverence, poured wine for two, drank for one. One soldier carved a name into a fig tree outside camp. Another left a plate untouched beside his own each night. They did not speak of it, because grief, when shared, does not require conversation. It only needs space. And food. Simple, familiar, warm, became that space. The kitchens cooked less, cooked better. Bowls meant for comfort. Plates meant for remembering. And every time Alexander lifted a spoon, it was not for flavor, but for presence. To say, you are gone, but I remain, and I will carry you in what I do next. Eventually, he left the city, marched again, ate again. Not with joy. But with rhythm, because mourning, too, has a rhythm, a way of feeding the body while tending to the hollow that cannot be filled. One night, long after, he was served the same dish they had eaten that day, the barley, the lentils, the cut figs. He ate it without comment, but when he was finished, he stood. And said only, he would have liked this one, then walked away, and nothing more was needed, because the meal had spoken, and the memory had been fed. Not every night in Alexander's camp was solemn. Some nights blurred, with wine, with laughter, with the sound of cups colliding and voices rising in rhythms just shy of song. These were the nights when rules softened and stories swelled, when even the divine was invited to drink, because gods, too, were said to get drunk. And Alexander, ever drawn to myth, often drank as if he were among them. It didn't start loud. It started with a single cup, poured carefully, passed hand to hand. The wine was always too sweet or too sharp. It tasted of grape skins and memory, of heat trapped in clay jars for too long, but it warmed. And that was enough. The cups grew. Fuller. The toasts got longer. They toasted to victories behind them, to cities not yet taken, to horses that never threw them, and to women who would never wait. Sometimes they toasted to silence. Other times they toasted to nothing, just for the feel of the cup in hand and the heat in the throat. Food arrived late on these nights. Not carefully plated, not symbolic, just plenty. Roasted meats, torn apart by fingers and shared without question. Nuts, salty and scattered. Bread, dipped in oil and wine. And whatever sauce remained. No one asked where the cutlery was. No one needed it. They leaned on elbows, spoke with mouths full, wiped their hands on their cloaks and kept eating. Alexander sat in the center. Not above them, among them. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. He laughed. Not the sharp laugh of command, the real one, the one that bent him forward, eyes closed, chest shaking. He played the games too, the old ones from Macedonia, from boyhood, from long nights before any city had fallen. Stone throw contests, riddle trades, finger guessing, drinking until you could no longer remember who had insulted who the day before. On these nights, the world shrank. It became the circle of firelight, the edge of a bowl, the space between shoulders leaning in. No war. No maps. Just stories. And once, a performance. One soldier, emboldened by too much wine and too little self-preservation, stood up on a bench and impersonated a Persian noble at court. He was terrible. Everyone howled. Alexander threw a fig. At his head, the soldier bowed, wobbled, and declared himself the ambassador of grapes. The title stuck for a week. Even the servants smiled. Even the guards forgot to guard. Even the night, heavy with stars and silence, seemed to lean in to listen. But wine is a trickster. It feeds friendship, then teases truth. Some nights ended with arms around shoulders and tears swallowed in laughter. Other nights ended with broken cups and sudden silence. Once, two men argued over the last piece of lamb. Words turned to shouts. Shouts turned to fists. Alexander did not stop them. He watched, and when they fell, breathless and red-faced, he said only, "Next time, I'll eat it first." The room laughed. And so did the men. Because forgiveness came easier with full stomachs and flushed cheeks. But not always. Some wounds wine could not dull. And sometimes, the next morning held a different kind of silence, the heavy one, the one that comes after too much honesty. Still, the dinners continued. Because they needed them. The games, the spilling, the blur. It reminded them they were human, that kings could get drunk, that warriors could sing badly, that even gods, in their temples, might sometimes sit crooked and eat with their fingers. Alexander often poured the last drink himself, not into a cup, into the fire, a tribute. To Dionysus, or memory, or both, and the flame would hiss and rise, and in that flicker they felt something sacred. Not holy, just real. Like warmth that doesn't ask questions. Like food that doesn't need seasoning. Like laughter that doesn't need permission. It didn't feel like the end. It never does. The room was full. The fire was steady. The cups were full, and the air smelled like meat and wine, and the promise of another night like any other. Alexander laughed. That's what the scrolls say. He laughed and ate and poured for others before pouring for himself. No crown on his head, no sword at his side, just a clay cup in one hand and a skewer of roasted duck in the other. The table groaned beneath the weight of it all. Honeyed cakes, stacked high like miniature temples. Bowls of rice, of lentils, of meats marinated in cinnamon and red wine. Sliced peaches glistening with syrup. Flatbreads still steaming. Goat cheese tucked into vine leaves. Everything he liked. Everything they had. No one knew it would be the last. No one ever does. He had been tired, yes. But when wasn't he? He had been quieter, maybe. But some days required more stillness than others. They toasted. To victories. To cities. To ships. To the moon. Even because one man said it looked especially full and watchful that night. Alexander raised his cup to that. 2. He was generous. With his wine, with his attention, with his silence. He listened more than he spoke. Let others fill the night. With noise while he leaned back, chewing slowly, watching the candles dance, like they were trying to whisper something only he could hear. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe. If you'd like more nights like this. He didn't eat much, just enough. A bite of lamb, a slice of bread he broke in half and passed to the man beside him. A gesture so no one thought to write it down. And yet it lives, even now. He drank, but not deeply. Not like the others, who tilted their heads and forgot their fears. He sipped. Like someone with a secret, or someone listening for something. Far away, the laughter grew. The dishes emptied. The wine dulled the room into comfort. Someone sang off-key, but beautifully. And Alexander smiled, not the grin of conquest, the quiet one, the one he wore when something made sense in a way. He couldn't explain then. Slowly he stood, not to speak, just to leave. A nod here, a hand on a shoulder there. Glance back at the table, and then the curtain fell behind him. He never returned to it. That was the last banquet, in the days that followed. The tent dimmed. The plates were cleared. The food went untouched. The wine soured, and he lay in a room that smelled of herbs and waiting. They brought him water, honey, soft fruits, but nothing stayed. The appetite was gone, the belly quiet, the silence louder than the feasts had ever been. They say he whispered, of gods, of rivers, of cities that hadn't yet been built, but never of food, because hunger had left him. Only memory remained. The men remembered. They remembered the taste of his laughter, the smell of roasted duck, the way he passed the bread, the way he watched the fire, and the last thing he truly tasted, a moment when everyone felt full, together, still, a banquet with no final toast, just a closing of eyes, cup left half filled, and the warmth of a meal shared. Even with what was coming, in the days after, the bowl remained, not out of ceremony, not by order, it simply wasn't taken away, it sat where it had been placed, near his bedside, carved from wood, worn smooth by years of use, once filled with fruit or broth, now empty, cleaned, but not repurposed, a quiet symbol in a room that no longer smelled of food, the tent, once thick with the perfume of roasting meat, fresh bread, spilled wine, now carried the scent of linen, oil, and time passing. Alexander was gone, and the empire, impossibly vast, impossibly full, felt hollow, not in maps or orders, but in the places he had touched without speaking. The chair where he'd once peeled a fig, the corner where he'd once asked for more salt, the floor where he'd dropped a slice of bread and laughed when someone tried to clean it too quickly. His appetite had shaped the days. Now, without it, the rhythm faltered. Meals still arrived. Of course they did. The soldiers had to eat. The staff had to continue. The cooks lit fires out of habit, stirred pots out of duty. But the food tasted different. Now, not worse, just heavier. Like it was trying too hard to mean something. Some kept their heads down while eating. Others raised their cups. To what? They weren't sure. The bowl stayed. Someone wiped it daily. Once. A fig was placed in it, quietly, then removed the next day when it began to soften. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. They talked in hushed tones about what he would have wanted. More banquets? Fewer? Would he have wished the kitchens to stop, or keep feeding as if he still sat among them? No one knew, so they did both. Some nights there were feasts, as if to conjure his spirit with every cinnamon-slicked apricot, every lamb spiced in his name. Other nights there was only bread, broken in silence, dipped in oil, eaten slowly, because sometimes morning isn't loud, it's a spoon left untouched, a seat unfilled, and an empire too large to gather around one table. In far cities, people prepared dishes they thought he might have liked. They invented favorites, claimed he had, praised their wine, swore he once asked for a second helping of their mother's stew. They wanted to belong to his hunger, to be remembered in his mouth, because what we feed becomes part of who we are, and who we are remembered by. And Alexander had eaten everywhere, in palaces and tents, by rivers and fires. He had chewed the world slowly, let it open to him, bite by bite, and now the bowl was empty, not because there was nothing left to give, but because no one could fill it in quite the same way. The cooks who had known him best packed their tools with extra care. tied herbs in cloth, bundles, sealed oils in clay, not for another, king, but for themselves. Because once you have cooked for someone who made bread, feel like ceremony. Every crust afterward feels different. The bowl, they say, was eventually wrapped in linen, placed in a crate. No one said where it went, because some things aren't kept for display. They're kept for memory. And maybe somewhere it still rests, still smooth, still waiting. Not for a king, but for the story that was shared in every meal. For the silence that followed, for the taste that lingers long after the appetite has gone. What remains of a man after the map fades? Not the statues, they crack. Not the battles, they blur. Not even the cities, their names change in the mouths of the living. But sometimes a taste remains, a way he once broke bread, a recipe passed without writing, a pinch of spice whispered between generations. This is how Alexander endures, not only in conquest, but in crumbs. In the quiet, unrecorded moments when the world did not watch, a bite shared beside a fire, a meal eaten without ceremony.